There he is.
Welcome.
Oh, there you go.
How you doing?
Good, you.
Good, good, good. Cool. So, Rob and I were just going to launch into some discussion around cash, but if you have a specific question, please let me know. No, you're just wanting general,
Yeah,
pick up some general knowledge. Okay,
yeah,
cool. All right, sweet. So, all right. So, Rob, when I was, we've been going a little bit back and forth on the preparation for this, but I started to ask myself like the fundamental question of like, why does this matter to somebody? I think, the only reason that somebody would be watching this is if they ever had a time or they're in a time now where they were concerned about cash. Basically, fundamentally, like that I think is what's bringing this into sort of the consciousness for whoever's wanting to learn more about this topic. And then sort of like backed into that. So like I was thinking, okay, well, what are the things that you need cash for? And so there's examples of that. And I think for people who are new to this topic, there's a distinction. There's the first layer of understanding is understanding the distinction between the types of expenses that you need cash to service and other types of expenses that aren't cash dependent, right? So, I mean, I don't have these laid out, but just thinking like payroll is probably the most prominent like cash expense. I think there are probably some tricky ways to get around that. Um, there are some services for that provide the ability, I think, to pay contractors with credit. I believe I'm almost certain that exists. But in general, for like the majority of businesses, payroll is like a cash transaction. Rent in general, there are going to be exceptions to all of these examples, and I'm sure people will be able to raise their hands and provide them. But rent is another example where you need to like cut a check as opposed to like, a subscription to Figma or Notion or Zoom, right? Those are like hitting your credit card all the time. And so I think the first layer of understanding is understanding like on the expense side, what's a cash expense and what is a non-cash expense. Non-cash is such a like an accounting term. I almost hate to use it, but it does matter. Just it does make sense to start to introduce that terminology like into this discussion. Anything else like come to mind, Rob, like around that territory?
I think those are I mean, I think payroll and rent tend to be the biggest two. And then obviously like just some general utilities and things like that are
Yeah,
often in the mix.
right.
Um, depending on your profession, if you've got, yeah, if you've got, um, automobiles or vans or, things like that,
Yeah.
that you
Yeah,
need for
that's
your
a good one.
business, like
That's
those
a
would
good
be
point.
regular expenses that you
Yeah,
just need
great
to
point.
pay for every month.
Lease payments, truck payments. Yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
Okay, cool. So then I think the next order of approaching this from an understanding standpoint is like, why does it matter if something is like a cash or a non-cash expense? And I think, the most direct answer to that question is timing. And I think like, when you're in the routine of running a business and you're allocating, cash as a finite resource to different parts of your business, the timing is something that's like the follow on, sort of element that forces itself into that conversation. So like, when am I going to need to make these payments? And so I think like you have a couple reasons for timing, and this is Rob where I want you to join in because like you're an expert on like that timing aspect of this for the reasons that'll become obvious in a second. But in general, like, when a business is managing cash, they have sort of like routine timing issues because cash is generally a finite resource. And then they have like structural timing issues. And I think it makes sense to strike a distinction between those two and explain like what those drivers are. So in general, like if you're managing a a portion of cash that's going to service the running of the business. So this is generally called working capital. And that cash gets like stretched and drawn on at different points, like in your business cycle to service the business, right? So like payroll generally happens every 2 weeks. Some businesses it happens every week, which is really tough for the business owner, but it does happen. Um, and then you have like the timing components of like when vendor payments are due, and you have the timing components on the cash inflow side of like when you're collecting money, like when your project milestones are due, like all of those sort of inflow timing components. And so the whole exercise is to like match those two things up. And then for other businesses, there's like a seasonal timing component that's structural. And like, Rob has a lot of experience in that. And that's an example where, broad examples like landscape company, and you only collect on your landscape, like your lawn service contracts generally in the summertime. And then you have, if you're like on the East Coast or the Midwest, you have like a snow removal, like, but each of those have seasonal features. Rob, tell me about your experience on the seasonal side and how amazing that is.
How awesome it is. Um, yeah, so for those of you who don't know, I owned and operated a stand-up paddleboard and canoe manufacturing business, and obviously you've got I guess number one, paddleboards we manufactured overseas in Asia, and so you have this business cycle, an annual business cycle where you're selling product in the spring and summer, and then you're basically manufacturing the product in the fall and winter. And so you've got this cycle of cash coming in the spring and summer and cash going back out in the fall and winter. But when you start the business, you start by having to like start somewhere, which is like spending money. So you're trying to figure out a way to fund those initial purchases for inventory and hold on long enough with have enough cash in the bank to be able to survive not only all the operational expenses, the normal OpEx that you have to run a business day to day, but also to fund that spike in inventory that you're going to need in order to sell that in the spring and summer, which creates a bunch of different problems, honestly, in terms of just like where do you find the cash? How do you make it last? And then how do you structure payments with your customers in order to bring that cash back in? And so for walking through a typical business cycle, there's just like where do you find the cash in the fall to fund the inventory purchases? And there's a whole host of ways to do that. We were lucky enough that the business, we had a line of credit basically that we drew on and to fund inventory purchases, and then did a lot of incentivizing. We sold wholesale through a dealer network, so not necessarily waiting for like a D2C customer to buy something online. Although that was a way that we sold things, but we try to incentivize our dealer base to just early and pay us early. And so there's a whole incentive structure that you would use, or we developed over time to, depending on the timing of the delivery and the timing of the payment, there was a certain discount structure that was in place in order to incentivize that kind of behavior. So I think in general, there is not just like, you don't have to invoice and just like do net, with net 30 dating. There are ways that you can speed up the cash cycle. And some of that is just by giving even some minor discounts for early payment, or for the way that you structure your contracts, so that if you're in a product, it can be based on delivery or paying early. But if you're in like a creative services, you can be thinking about just like certain gates that you have in the process that you're using with clients, and how do you divvy up the payments and the timing of that to better match the cost of producing those services. So if your costs come early but you're getting paid late, like how do you put certain gates in your negotiation with your clients in order to make sure that you're getting paid you're getting paid in a way that the timing matches up with your cost structure, which I think is really, it's easier said than done. But I think that um, not just accepting the standard in terms of just like, yeah, we're gonna bill and we're gonna get paid in 30 days is something that's important to take a look at.
Yeah, that's a great point. The reason so there's a couple of things that I like. One is I think using a seasonal business as an example is a great framework because it's such an extreme example of what businesses like work through already, you know? So it's just like it's the same elements, but they're stretched apart even longer. So, you know, the things that are like always tugging at the cash reserves of a business are, you know, payroll and, you know, customer deposits, right? Like those are the primary things that are pushing and pulling like on both sides of the cash you know, sort of the cash reserves of a business. And I think you brought up a great point, which is like I think where it's not going on offense, but it's certainly like advocating yourself. And I think where businesses like have a hard time is when they just like fall into a posture of like this is the way it is, you know? And I think the business, like in small business in general, like you just have to advocate for yourself. And that's kind of like the name of the game. No, like nobody's going to do it for you. You just have to do it on your own. And I think finding examples like the one you just took us through of, getting customers to pay you a little bit early or, getting vendors to just like wait a half a beat longer. Those can be like really successful tactics, and a lot of times they're just a conversation, and people generally like to avoid those kinds of conversations, but I think the outcomes of those conversations can be massive. So as an example, like when I was running a landscape company, we would just call our vendors and like if we had net 30 terms, we would just say, hey, would it be okay if we just could we manage our account on a net 45 basis? Like a lot of times this is easier when you're dealing with a larger company, but a lot of times like you're picking up the person on the other phone is like in charge of AP, and like they don't care, like they're not managing like the same size business as you are. So if you have a vendor, this is like this is a great small business tactic, I think, is like if you have like a supplier or a vendor that's a lot larger than you are, then like that's an opportunity because they're not as hand to mouth as you are from a cash standpoint. So that's just like a phone call, and I think just so many people just don't pick up the phone, and it just can be a huge benefit. And then, the same thing on the customer side. It's just like, everybody has these, like anybody that's in, anybody that's a small business owner has been in QuickBooks, and you go in, you see for yourself, like these things are just like default, right? It like defaults to net 30, right? And like, on the invoicing template, but like people aren't putting like a ton of thought into that. So, if you can just like, if you're negotiating a contract and you can just say, hey, would it be okay? Like, could we manage this like on receipt, or could we manage this like, is it reasonable for you to like pay a week after we submit the invoice? Like, these kinds of things you can transfer, what's like what appears to be like a very structural element into like a conversational one and solve a huge cash problem in doing that. I've seen that work like over and over again.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, just like if you're thinking about just kind of standard operational procedures for somebody who's in the accounts receivable collections department, they're taking in checks every month, and they're looking at what's due, and oftentimes like their procedures aren't really kicking, like they're not kicking into high gear until they haven't seen payments
Later.
been missing for more than 15 days or something like
Yeah.
that, and then it starts to escalate from there. And so there's even some wiggle room just in like a little bit of extra float on that. And it depends on the industry that you're in. Some are going to be a little bit more prickly than others in terms of just like payments on the due date. But I think
Yeah.
there tends to be some wiggle room in terms of just being able to draw out payments on AR, if needed.
Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to, I guess, go back to is doing some sort of cash forecasting exercise on an annual, like for a lot of people, for me, it was needed, like you needed to do it almost like an annual
Yeah.
forecast to see the full picture. Some people it may make sense to do something more like the next quarter, the next 6 months, the next month. But it was really telling in terms of you could see where the where you would expect the big spikes and where you would expect, to be really negative. And you could start to feel like you had some, like just having that picture gave you some insight into, okay, so we need to pull X thousands of dollars forward, or we need to draw that payment structure out a little bit. And so what are the things that I should be asking for? And it, and also in terms of not only like what is it that I'm asking for, but in like what's the scope or the magnitude of the things that need to change in order to like feel more comfortable about with that. And so I think spending a little bit of time building out a cash forecast or cash model is something that is, if you're feeling like if you're running a business where it feels like that's always a battle, then having spent a little bit of time working through those exercises, I think is really valuable. And that's something that, as I guess as advisors of Aardvark and working with clients here, that's something we can help with if that's something that's important to
Yeah.
people too. But to me, that was like really eye opening in terms of understanding where the adjustments were needed, what was the timing of that, and what was the magnitude of the changes that are needed in order to make, in order to smooth the business out a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great call. And I think when you hear cash forecast, it sounds like an intimidating exercise. It's relatively straightforward. The way I think of it is like you're trying to answer four fundamental questions. Sort of like, what's the starting point? Like, where are we in this current moment, which is indicated by your bank balance? And then where am I in the cash cycle, which is a function of when am I expecting payment from who, how much, and when is that going to hit? And then on the expense side, it's, when are my expense obligations to who, how much, and when, and so when we're looking at, again, making the distinction between the cash obligations and the non-cash obligations, anything that's a non-cash obligation eventually turns into a cash obligation at some point. You can't get away from it forever, but it does help with the timing. And an example of that would be like, you pay, like we're on Zoom right now. So like, I pay Zoom on the credit card, like that turns into a cash payment when I pay my credit card bill with cash. Like I can't, I can only, even if I was transferring, credit card balances like from one credit card company to another, like you can only like run that out so far. So everything eventually becomes a cash payment. But what we're talking about here, over and over again, what we touch on is like is managing cash as a function of timing in general. Like that's the general principle. And I think it's easy for I think sometimes small business owners get intimidated by working through the timing aspect of it because they conflate it with like I'm deferring expense that I owe. You know what I'm saying? Like so like people some business owners will just be like, I just want to pay cash just because like I know the expense is paid, like they don't want to put it on a credit card because now it's debt, right? And like that's a very responsible distinction, but I think there is like clarity to be struck the the difference between being responsible to your obligations and helping yourself out from a timing standpoint. So like if you have contracts that are structured a certain way, like where you're not getting paid immediately or you're not getting paid like before the work is done. I mean, I think I'm just heading into sort of like a very like firm statement here, but just like if you're not getting paid in full for the work that you're doing, you need timing help on the expense side in order to make things like run to your benefit. I mean, I do you agree with that statement, Rob?
Yeah, I would say I do for the most part, and I do think that um, some of it has to do with just the fact that some of it is just is a matter of just like days.
Yeah.
So like if you're that close, then is probably less important. But I do think that that matching principle is a pretty fundamental thing. And if you can
Yeah.
structure your business to match, your revenue and expense as closely as possible, it's pretty powerful. And I realize that like not all businesses you can do that with. And sometimes you just have to build it into your margin. Like you could deal with it in a
Yes.
different way. You could just
Yeah.
decide, you know what, if this is not the lever I want to pull, I'm going to just charge. I just need to charge more
It's a
because
great
I
point.
can't make like
Yeah.
in order to hold the float. So, if you don't want to take that approach of, you know, dealing with it in one manner, you have to deal with it in a different manner. And that different manner, maybe you just charge more for it.
Yeah. Great point. And I think that raises like the situation where managing cash, I think can start to feel like a dirty subject is when you don't have the margin to like meet your obligations. So like if you're just managing cash to delay a problem, like a structural problem that can never be solved because you're not charging enough, that's where cash management I think starts to feel dirty for like a small business owner. And that reveals a different kind of problem for the business. But in general, like if you're charging enough margin and you just have these timing features to navigate, then like you're right. You can either do one of two things. You can charge more so that you have more available cash to draw from to, meet these obligations, and it puts less stress on like the timing aspects of the business. Or you can just be more strategic and more like miserly with your terms, and you can get away with it in that way too. It's a great point that you have sort of like two paths, but you do have to kind of like pick one or the other.
For sure. Like in the businesses that I work with, there's like even just like simple things like credit card credit card processing fees. Like, are you going to let your customers pay with a credit card? And if so,
Right.
are you going to be the type of person who charges the extra three? Like, you say, "Yep, I'll accept a credit card, but I'm going to charge you an extra 3%," or are you the person who's going to just build the extra 3% into your your pricing and your cost structure so that it's not even a conversation? And so
Yeah.
it's just it's a fundamental choice on like how you want to do it. But if somebody's paying by credit card, it costs you 3%. So like you have to
Yeah.
figure out a way to either recoup that directly from the customer, or you have to figure out a way to build it into your pricing. Um, but those are the types of things where they come up, and if you aren't thinking about it and you're just like, oh, I'll take a credit card, I'll eat a 3%. You realize that that over time adds up, and so you're
Yeah.
just being aware of these little either convenience charges or the cost of net net 30 terms versus doing receipt, or net 60 versus net 30. Like those are decisions that have costs associated with them, and being aware of it and then making some decisions around that is just like kind of a fundamental piece of operating a business in a way that is like going to be smart long term.
Yeah. And I think, where the small business experience becomes difficult is where, you know, like we can make these inadvertent compromises, and they just like they compound, and like suddenly you're the one that's like doing all the compromising, and like you're just living this very difficult experience, right? Because you're like, oh, I don't want to chase off a customer, like I don't want to scare them away on the 3%. It's like, oh, and I want my contractors to feel taken care of, so I'll pay them right away. And so like those two things, like when they cross up, like you're putting yourself in like a world of hurt, on that side, just in business in general, it's really just really becomes hard. Um, I feel like a
It's
lot
easy
of,
to mask those things.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's easy to mask those things too, and like being customer centric, or being,
Yeah,
you
great
know,
call. Fallacy,
being like
fallacy.
we're gonna, yeah, we're easy to work with, and these are the things that are part of our core values, and I fundamentally get it, but I also think sometimes it's a way of making excuses for just not wanting to do some of the more tedious pieces of the work as well.
Yeah, and I think when you look across the landscape of the businesses that really are good at advocating for themselves, I mean, it's not only the ones that can, but like you have you have the obvious examples of like, you're paying, I don't know, you pay for like, the bank doesn't like wait to collect their like service charges. They just like take them out, because like that's a function of their business, so that's like on the extreme example. But like I was talking to my dad the other day, he lives down in Florida. They had like an air conditioning repair needed. Like obviously you're gonna get your air conditioning repaired in the summer in Florida. And like the repair, like the technician just, he does the work and then he like presents my dad with an iPad like before he leaves, and it's like, I mean, what's he gonna do? And like, he's not gonna be like, oh, I'll put a check in the mail, 30 days. He's just like, no, like he doesn't. Service technician like doesn't give him like an alternative. And I think like when you can make, I think that is like a helpful like piece of ammunition for the small business owner. It's just like make these things matter, of course, make them impersonal, and and you can like begin to advocate for yourself like anew, if you do that rather than like, oh gee, would it be okay if, just like, yeah, like, well, you know, just when we wrap up the shoot, like, the invoice will be in your inbox the next day. Like it's really helpful to us if you can take care of it, something like that, just make it like, just edge your way towards like more aggressive than you're accustomed to feeling. It's going to feel aggressive to you, but it doesn't feel aggressive to the customer in general in small business, I would say.
Totally.
All right.
Sometimes it's not like and it is adjustment. Like there is going to be some pain, and there is going to be, and there maybe even be points where like the customers that you've been working with in the past that you treated with that kind of like a little bit like more easygoing payment terms, and maybe didn't charge the things you needed to charge for. When you start to change, like there are going to be some people who maybe give you a little pushback, or you know, want the same deal that they got before, and it's okay to have a little friction every once in a while, and some of that too. So just know
Yeah.
that that's like part of the process.
Yeah, totally. The thing that we've touched on this a little bit, but the thing that I used to see in the trades all the time that was really tough. It was sort of like the banner of the company I worked for is like they prided themselves on paying their subcontractors like right away, like as soon as the work was done. And the way they justified it is they would say like, oh, well, these contractors, like they do more for us. Like, or if we call them, like they jump too, that was always like the thinking, the justification for why they did that. Uh, I think there's two components there that warrant like mentioning. One is it's like it's really harmful for the cash position of your business because like this is like this was house building at the time, right? So it's like, these are big chunks of money, and in general, like you have to pay by wire, or you pay by check, but like it's not a credit card payment, whatever it is. Usually, like you're waiting for like a project milestone to be complete. So they're big, like sort of lumbering like cycles of cash coming in, right? It's like a lot of cash when it comes in, but it's usually like on the slower side. But contractors are doing work like on the job all the time, and they're, submitting their invoices like a lot of times weekly, and this company was like paying them out weekly. And the reason they were excusing it is they had created a story of like the value of the contractor. Now I can tell you that these subcontractors they were being just as attentive to other general contractors. Like maybe not on the extreme side. Maybe the guy, like maybe the GC with like the pickup truck with like the dog in the back, like, maybe they weren't like hopping to that guy, but like there was like a tier of like really like well-known general contractors working in this space. And these subcontractors were all picking up the phone just as quickly to answer to either one of these. And it wasn't just because it wasn't the company I wasn't working for was at the head of the line just because they paid everybody like a week behind, they valued all those relationships like the same. And so like what I'm always trying to encourage is create a value proposition around a different thing, not just the thing that's like the most important element to your business, because like it's so hard for you to manage in that case, it's like create different aspects of the relationship that they're going to value. It's like those unexpected things, like on the shoot or on the job site, when they sound like cliches, but they're real things. Like whenever like senior person would come on the job site and bring coffees for like all the electricians, it's like that's an unexpected thing. It costs $25. Like it's a huge value. Like it's a signal that the relationship is important. But it's like find ways to signal that but that doesn't use like one of the core levers of your business's ability to operate. Is like what I'm always trying to advocate for. Or to your point, like if you're just like charging so much money that you can, that you can like luxuriate in that payment cycle to your contractors, like that's something that you've earned, but know what that is. Know that it's like an expense, like know that it's a sort of a little bit of a harmful element to your business from a cash standpoint that you've earned the ability to do. But I think it's just about knowing it rather than just doing it.
Hmm. No, for sure.
Um, okay, cool. The other thing I wanted to touch on, first of all, any questions from the gallery before we move on to the next? Okay. Um, uh, the uh, the other sort of thing that I like, we've touched on a lot of these things, but just I think the thing I like about this topic is that you can influence a lot of the elements that feel harmful with like human behaviors. So this conversation always comes up as a function of it's like it's under the banner of small business finance, right? It's like there are all kinds of like financial terms, but really what it fundamentally comes down to, and this is for finance, like small business finance more broadly, but for this subject specifically as well, is that like you can influence these elements with human behaviors, and it's like the kinds of things like calling the contractor or calling the vendor and saying, hey, would you mind if we operated on net 45 terms, like that kind of thing. Same thing on the customer side. What was your approach like when you were running that business? How were you how were you navigating like the extremes of managing a seasonal business, and how were you navigating that through, would you say, like the relationships you developed, or through sort of structural elements that you just managed in the correct way? How would you describe that?
It was, I think it was a little bit of both.
Okay.
Um, I think the interesting thing about the business that I was in was there was a little bit of there was a structural element that you could only push the vendor side so far in terms of payment. Like you had to, obviously when you're doing import work, you like ultimately like you have to get the product across the border, and that border like it's got to be paid for before across the border. Otherwise, there's not much like somebody in China can do to recover that product if you don't pay for it once it's across. So like you can structure like the deposits but eventually like you have to pay for it, and you have to get it in the country before you can ship it out. So there's by default going to be a window where you're just you're kind of stuck with like I paid out some cash and now I'm waiting to get that cash back in. But in terms of like structurally, um, one of the key things was like trying to make sure that there was enough margin built in, and there was like number one, we charged enough on the price for the product, and there was enough margin built in so that we could create an incentive structure. We could offer discounting to try to give them enough incentive to like pull that inventory forward and through the system as quickly as possible. And then there's also a timing aspect in terms of like the production cycle. So you did want to wait as late as you could to produce product and try to ship it in as close to when you thought you were going to need it, so that you were fundamentally again like trying to match like that last payment out with the first payment coming in from your customers.
Yeah.
And so um there's like going back to that whole like cash forecasting thing. It's just like, okay, when is the last possible moment I can I can put my production orders in and pay my vendors, and what's the absolute earliest I can get my customers to take product and pay for it, and what kind of margin structure do I need in order to incentivize the behaviors that I need in order to have the business like run as close to cash, cash positive in as many months as possible. And that was like a learning over many years, and it was never perfect. Like it was never perfected. And I think that part of it too is just having that understanding that like it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to be done with the work. Like your customers change, your vendors change, the work never goes away. And so it's not something that you can do. Like you can't just do a project to analyze this once and then like walk away and expect that it's going to be the same moving forward. Like every year or every few months, it's worth revisiting because the market changes, the environment changes. You might have more leverage now than you had 6 months ago or a year ago. Like if we're talking about COVID, like I had no leverage. Like I was going to get what I was going to get, and I had no. I guess I had no leverage on the vendor side, but like my dealer, like the dealer base asking for product, also didn't have a lot of leverage. So like it did kind of balance out. But there are times like now, things would be different. And I think that the markets change, and sometimes you can be more aggressive with certain aspects of your business. And sometimes you have to like understand you are where you are and then react to that appropriately and make those adjustments and understand your position in the value chain and where the leverage stands. And sometimes you've got the leverage and sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
Um,
And just to clarify, like when we're talking about building in enough margin, we're talking about ensuring that there's enough profit in the product or service to be able to fund the operation of the business in the short term, right?
yeah. And honestly, in the long term too, strategically, like what are the, if you're, and I think that's another thing that I guess you have to kind of pay attention to, and we haven't talked about, but like there's a certain like if you're if your business is growing rapidly, like you have to have
Yeah.
enough margin also in your product to fund that growth. And if you don't have that margin, like you can be growing rapidly and you can actually like you can kill your business pretty quickly. If you're
Yeah.
growing, if you're growing really, really rapidly, it's actually pretty easy to run out of cash.
Yeah. That's a great
Um,
point.
and if you run out of cash, obviously you don't have a business. So
Yeah.
or you start to break promises to customers that you sold product or services to because you can't deliver on it because you don't have the cash to pay for the infrastructure or the product in order to deliver on what you promised. So that was one of the things too early on in the business that I learned was just very quickly that they're just like we were growing. There was never like even though we were profitable, there was never cash around because that cash was constantly whatever profit we had was that cash was constantly being reinvested in growth, whether it be more product or it be more space or it meant like we needed vehicles or like whatever it happened to be. um, so it's important to understand that you do have a cap on how fast you can grow and how rapidly you can grow without causing other cash related issues. And so again, going back to the forecast, like
The
the
planning.
importance of
Yeah.
forecasting, like really understanding like how, like what makes sense and what can you make promises to, or who can you make promises to, and who do you need to say no to. Um, and that doesn't, I mean, that's an unusual circumstances, but oftentimes when you're small, like you have to grow fast, but you have in order to get to like a spot where you can like the business is sustainable. But it's really easy to run out of cash when you're small and you're growing fast because um, you just need to add expense, or you need
Yeah.
to add, there's things get out of whack pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
I think having some time to model that out is pretty important. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely times where we definitely outkicked our coverage in terms of the in terms of being able to really effectively um, grow in a way where it's just like, if we're making money but it doesn't feel like we're making any money, and you're going to go get a line of credit to fund more growth, and it's just like becomes a little bit of a vicious cycle. And that's that it's not an unusual problem, especially
Yeah.
in product. Like we don't have a lot of like product businesses, but like rapidly growing e-com businesses, rapidly growing product businesses, like it's really easy to run out of cash pretty quickly if you're growing quickly and not understanding the fundamentals of like that growth. You have to either go find equity or you have to find cash somehow to fund that.
Yeah. I think that your line about it feels, I know we're making money, but it doesn't feel like we're making money. I think like every small business owner in the history of the world can identify with that line. It's so true to form, and it's always, I think like it's always a symptom of a cash issue, right? Whether it's because it can feel like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? It's like you have to grow to be sustainable, to make progress, to, develop new opportunities, and that can strain cash. And so like, just describing like, a seasonal business trying to grow, it's just like, man, I mean, how much headwind can we possibly take, right? Because like you're just having to sort of stash all this cash or lay out all this cash well in advance of being able to receive it, but just in this cycle of like ordering product and then selling the product. And then in addition, like you have all of this expansion and all of these other cash requirements that are, getting taxed, not literally taxed, but, just taxed from the standpoint of burdened. Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, just so hard, and I think like this is a segue into a conversation that we have a bunch, but it's always with respect to line of credit. It's always, you get line of credit before you need it. Like that's always what I encourage, because it's so at the moment that you need it, it's so hard to find, and it's pretty readily available. Like if you're just in a good place, and most banks like, Amex, Chase, like, you can find ways to get like even modest lines of credit that will give you, it's like a release valve, and like in some plumbing or something, or just like, you just need an ability to get a little bit of relief from like a tight cycle. And, line of credit and credit cards are like the small business, like best friends, as long as you're managing them responsibly in the context of the planning exercise that we keep referring to. Um, Again, like, running that landscape company, we used to like, put a few $100,000 on the credit card every month. That would just get flushed out as a function of the business operation. It was never building up a balance. It was just a function of buying a little bit more time because all of the customers were not paying on the day that they received the invoice or on the day that the work was done. So, just one of those classic examples where the small business incurs the expense, not quite on the day that the work was done, but pretty close after that. But you don't get the money until like well past that date, right? So we're just like, again, a timing mismatch happens on almost all small businesses. And, you need to find tools to get relief from that.
Yeah, I mean, every like pretty much every small business has this like function of like you get paid when the work is done,
Yeah.
and so you have to put that cash out in order to get paid, and there's just naturally going to be a timing issue. And to your point around the line of credit, I think that yeah, it's just an imperative tool. It's just such a safety. It's such a safety net, and it's also important to recognize that, as your business grows, you're likely able to go get a bigger one. And again, whether you need it or not, just having the ability to um, expand that line of credit over time is important, just because you never know when you're gonna need to dip into it.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I mean, hopefully you don't, but like there's some businesses where it's pretty natural to have to do that until you're to a certain size. Like again, going back to the example that I had, like if you're growing fast, like you naturally have to have that line of credit, because there's just not enough fuel through the cash that the business was creating,
Yeah.
to fund the growth. So you
Right.
needed some mechanism to infuse the business with cash to make it through the next cycle.
Yeah.
And so um, lines of credit are just like it's like a tool in the tool belt
Yeah.
that's pretty important.
Yeah. As we wind up the discussion, David, any thoughts, questions that we can address? Zach, anything that comes to mind on your end? I feel like Rob and I are throats are hoarse talking about cash. Anything that we can, not because of the topic itself, but just in terms of, hearing ourselves speak, anything we can help illuminate or talk through?
I mean, the one kind of problem we have is like we get like all kinds of like small like fees and stuff that we rack up just like with different software and like services that we have to sign up for like as things change and like sometimes uh softwares will change and we'll have to like move to one, we're still in the other, and we'll have to buy seats for employees and stuff like that. And it it, it requires like a lot of like tending that and like going like a lot of time to like go through and like cancel these seats or cancel this service or make sure that this is like totally appropriate. And I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it seems like it's it's frustrating because it's like it's only it'll be like $5 a month seat or something like that. So it's not really worth me like spending like an hour and a half with customer service to try and like figure out how to do this with like 3 different things. But then 6 months goes by, I'm like, nah, our software subscriptions are really starting to add up with different
Yeah.
things, and maybe they're like 20% too high, across the board, especially when it's like 4 different seats and like 5 different things that we only needed for like a week or something stupid like that. But it's difficult sometimes, like balancing like the work to like manage like that versus like like just totally wasting money. And like like I've never gotten that right.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, things come to mind to me are, just like first question is, are these typically things required to service customers or to run the business more broadly or ambiguous?
It's a mix, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
sometimes it's to run the business. Sometimes it'll be like our design software or something like that. Which I mean, I guess that's like directly to service customers, but then sometimes it's really like to, more just process. Like we
Yeah.
only really need Photoshop or something like that, but then we're also like using Figma so that we can work with one particular like third
Yeah.
party designer or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is to make sure that, like, if any projects have a like unique requirement, that that's being captured in the scope detail, just because it's such a, yeah, I mean, it's just an example where, the small business is like capitulating on something, that ends up sort of having a compounding effect on, your expense structure in general, and then downstream of that, your cash constraints. And then in addition to that, I think almost every, client that we have can benefit from like a periodic review on the operating expense side of just like softwares and subscriptions is such a, usually it's a large one of the larger items, I would say, on the profit and loss statement of our clients. And so it's healthy to do that, if not annually, it sounds like, closer to quarterly or biannually for sure. Rob, any thoughts on that?
No, just I think that sometimes it's like really tempting just to look at software as $35 a month, and I don't have
Totally.
time to spend an hour on that this month, and then next thing you know, it's 4 months later, and like if you think of it more in terms of an annual, like if you annualize whatever that is,
Yeah.
it's all of a sudden like there's a sense of urgency in getting it taken care of because like yeah, I'm not going to be. It's not necessarily worth an hour for this month, but if I annualize that, I'll be upset with myself 6 or 8 months from now by not having it taken care of because it's literally just like money that's just like it's just like throwing it out the window. So having a little bit of context in terms of just like what is this cost? What is this truly going to cost me if I don't take care of it sooner than later is I think is important.
Yeah, for sure. And what happens to me is like a $35 thing. I sign up for, it's like $35 one month and it's like $75 the next month. I'm like,
Yeah, with
how did that
promotional
happen?
pricing, yeah. Well, also, Rob, I like what you were saying earlier about like the credit card fees. I mean, those like really add up. I mean, I try and, you know, like I like the credit card because it means they pay you like instantly, but you know, at the end of the year, like 3% on like the entire year's revenue. It's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think that there's definitely like vendors that I work with just who just add it. Like they just add it as a line item. It's just like 3% credit card fee. They just ship you the invoice and I'm just like, yeah, it costs them 3%. I guess I'm gonna pay. Like my option is I'm gonna pay it, or I'm gonna like figure out like, or I'm gonna pick up the phone and figure out a way to ACH that money to them, or I'm gonna write them a check. And I think a lot of that, like, and there's a lot of people who are just like happy to pay the invoice. And a lot of times, like the person who's paying the invoice isn't actually the person who has to really like, they're not really the person who actually has to pay the bill anyway. So I think part of it is just like understanding that, like sometimes we just overthink it. Yeah, I would just like if it was me, I'd either add the fee, or I would figure out a way to just make sure that you're accounting for that fee in like the way that you quote things. And you could even say like you could even call it in the quote, like you know, we're assuming you're gonna pay by credit cards. So this is our credit card price for this work. If you want a discount, like there's a discount if you pay by cash. But I think just like really thinking through like all aspects of the business is really important with like a level of granularity, that like 3% here, 4% there. Like that stuff like we never think it really adds up or makes up a difference, but like when you annualize it or you take it over like a longer time horizon, those are the things that really do make it like a meaningful difference. And especially in a small business where like those dollars, like I know it sounds silly, but like that could be a nice dinner out, or that could be like a short vacation getaway that you saved by just like paying attention to some of these smaller fees over time. So it does matter.
Yeah, for sure. Um, cool. David, any thoughts before we jump off? Anything we can address? Your cash situation is perfect. I'm just trolling you.
No, I think a lot of these things is just, as I've done this, I've just kind of made adjustment. You were talking about, how the percentages we're billing clients, and when we landed our biggest client, like we just didn't have the cash in the business to do a 50% deposit and then wait until 30 days after we wrapped the project for the other 50%. So we just had a conversation with them, and Rob, you touched on this of like those different gates that you come across. Is like, we do 50% when we start the project, then we do 25% balance payment when we wrap principal photography, because most of our expenses are in production. We have some at the end in post production, and then we do the final 25%. And we also moved them. They had to do net 50 or they could do net 5 for the deposit, and then we're net 15 on the rest of them. And it was just having a conversation and just explaining to them, like, the size of your project relative to the size of our business. Like, we need these payment structures in order for us to be able to do that. And the amount of money they're saving using us versus going to Los Angeles for production, which was what they were doing, they were happy to accommodate that. And with subscriptions, again, it's one of those things like they get away from me. And I asked that $35 a month, and then I look at it and I've spent $600 on that over the year, and I used it for a month. And so what I try to do is like, I'll put it on my calendar. As soon as I sign up for something, I'll put a reminder on my calendar to cancel this 20 days later, or I'll sign up for it and then the next day I'll cancel it. But it still runs through that month.
Yeah. Those are good tactics. Yeah.
Super smart. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. In terms of like that process that you're using with your largest client, have you tried, just out of curiosity, have you tried that tactic with anybody else in your client base in terms of just saying, no, like we're moving more to that standard with other clients as well?
We haven't, but honestly, like about 15 minutes into this call, I was like, there's no reason to just not do that, to just move to that with all of our clients instead of it being, a special case scenario for one of our clients. I don't see any reason that we couldn't do that for everybody. And so that's something that I took a note on, is just every project moving forward, we'll just adjust our contracts and just let our vendors know, or let our customers know, like, we're moving to this structure and here's why. And if that's a problem, we can talk about it. But like you said, most of these companies, they're not even gonna blink at it. They're gonna be, that's fine, whatever you guys need.
Yeah.
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 I think most businesses are reasonable. And if they don't, like, if they don't agree to it, or if they want to stick with the old way, I mean, I think that's just like, that's an indication to you that you probably need to just like make some adjustments on, like, I think that's a indication you can make some adjustments on your pricing, and potentially make up for some of that extra carry cost that you have. Like, if you have to dip into, that means you have to dip into your line of credit for, X thousands of dollars for a month or two. And so that's going to cost you an extra few $100 in interest. And so, like, that should, like, having that mindset of like that there's a cost to that, I think is an important aspect of, kind of thinking through how you structure that. So I'm glad you took those notes. That's awesome.
Yeah. I think, and advocating for yourself is like so easy at the beginning of a relationship. It's much harder like in the midst of an existing relationship. We had, like, at our last house, we had a cleaner, and it was like a new cleaner, and she just like, she invoiced like immediately. I think like we agreed to the service, and she just like she invoiced at the beginning of the month before any work had been done. And I was like, I mean, I kind of loved it from a small business standpoint, because she just like, like so many small business owners are on like the back foot, like, oh, please, is it okay? And she was just like, this is what it is, and like, I paid it, it's like, this is how she's going to do it, So I think you're able to sort of advocate for more and gain more territory when it's a new relationship, when you're setting the standard and you're setting the tone, and as opposed to like if it's like if somebody's been with you since day one and now they're seeing like a change in behavior and they're like, oh, what's this, So I always think it's just like, yeah, test yourself on the aggressive side. Whenever a small business owner thinks they're being aggressive, they're usually just being normal, just like go after it a little bit stronger. Usually that's the way it works. Any final thoughts,
Good
Rob?
point on like a great point with like the testing some of that on new clients too, and like, or just establishing, like, assuming that that's the way it's going to be moving forward. So great thought there. No, I mean, I guess in terms of final thoughts, I don't think that there's anything that anything fundamental that we didn't hit on, but I do think, I guess I want to just like hit the drum one more time in terms of the importance of just going through the process of building some sort of forecast for whatever time frames appropriate for your business, and it's fundamentally going to give you some insight in a way that is unexpected, and you don't necessarily know what that insight's going to be, but something will be exposed in that process. So just a nudge of encouragement for people to do that exercise.
Great point. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for jumping on. I'll chat with you guys both soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Jamie.
Jamie.
See ya. Bye.